Hello, everyone. We hope that you're enjoying your Independence Day, 4th of July weekend. This is our very special abbreviated version of our normal Courtroom Confidential episode. And it just so happens that this falls on one of the busiest true crime news weeks of the entire year. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm a former prosecutor in Los Angeles. Now I'm a criminal defense attorney. This is, of course, Courtroom Confidential, where we try to present to you both sides of the courtroom. We're recording this episode on Thursday, July 3rd, 2025, and this is your Courtroom Confidential weekly roundup. Let's go ahead and jump right in. First of all, the Bryan Kohberger case. The man charged with the November 2022 deaths of Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogen, Zaina Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin was at an end this week when on Monday, letters were sent out to the victims' families notifying them that a plea deal had shockingly been arrived at between the prosecution and the defense, and that they were taking the death penalty off of the table in exchange for Bryan Kohberger pleading to all 4 counts of murder for life in prison and waiving his right to appeal. He would plead to 4 first-degree murder counts in addition to the felony charge of burglary. That brings us to Wednesday. During a 50-minute change of plea hearing, which started with Judge Stephen Hippler informing the court and all listening that he was shocked by this disposition as much as anyone else, and that's why he had this at short notice. He had just learned of the plea on the same day, on Monday. He was under the impression, like everyone else, that this was going to trial. During that plea, Hippler asked Bryan Kohberger at least on 4 separate occasions whether or not he willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice aforethought stabbed and killed Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogen, Zaina Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin to death in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022. Then we heard from prosecutor Bill Thompson, who recounted a timeline of the events according to the evidence that the prosecution was aware of, largely talking about phone data and surveillance footage and many of the things that we have known before now. 2 of the 4 victims' families were unhappy with this plea. The Kaylee Gonzalez family, led by their patriarch, Steve Gonzalez, was very upset. He said that he had worked with others to try to change the judge's mind. He had a kind of letter writing campaign. He performed a protest of sorts outside of the courtroom by not entering the courtroom during the proceedings. And also Zaina Kernodle's family, her aunt, Kim Kernodle, told TMZ that they were not trying to spare us, talking about the prosecutors when arriving at this plea. Now, his sentencing will be for Wednesday, July 23rd at 9 a.m. Mountain Time. That's 8 a.m. Pacific or 11 a.m. Eastern. And if necessary, will carry over into July 24th. We will, of course, be covering that live on our Courtroom Confidential live trials channel. And like I said before, Kohberger faces the maximum life in prison for each of the 4 murder counts, as well as 10 years for the burglary charge. And it is expected that Hippler will sentence him to exactly that. So what's happening here? The biggest question that I've been asked over the last few days in regards to this is, was justice done? Do I agree with this? Do I think this was the right thing to do? First of all, let me say this. However these families choose to mourn this incredible loss, this loss that they will never recover from, they will never heal from, is fine with me. If they are upset, if they are frustrated, if they are beside themselves, if they are angry, that is all fine. I think that they are entitled to mourn and feel whatever feelings they have during this time. And if they agree with this, I support that as well. If there are family members who feel like this is the right thing to do, they should be given just as much space to do and grieve and have the emotions that they have as anybody else. But what are we left with here? Well, first of all, let's talk about the death penalty. if we're going to have the death penalty in this country, putting aside your feelings on the death penalty, if we're going to have the death penalty, then you would expect it would be reserved for a case like this. And Idaho does have the death. And if there is ever a case that presented the facts and circumstances where you would expect they would pursue death, it would be in this case. A nightmarish case. 4 young people just living their lives, not living high-risk lifestyles, living their lives, going to college, bright futures ahead of them, stolen from them in the middle of the night by an absolute psychopath who stabs them to death while they sleep. That is absolutely what the death penalty is reserved for. And you've got a defendant who, while he had no criminal history, shows such callousness and evil heart to commit this type of crime. If the government, if Idaho had pursued the death penalty, I would absolutely support it here. But we have to be honest and think about the realities involved in taking this to trial. I think that is the way that you must evaluate this, and the way that the prosecutor evaluated it, and the way I evaluated similar cases when I was a prosecutor. Many times, the victim's family might not support a plea disposition. If you think about it, a plea negotiation is naturally going to include giving something less than the maximum to the defendant, and that is always going to leave victims' families feeling like justice hasn't been done, as they feel here. And I think if they want to feel that way, I understand and encourage them to express their feelings on that. But trials are never a guarantee. A guilty verdict in this case was not guaranteed. I think it was a very strong case, but not guaranteed. You put 12 strangers in a room together, and who knows what they can agree on? Who knows how this trial may have played out? Who knows if things may have gone sideways, if it had ended up deadlocked, or even worse, with an acquittal. Those things do happen. Then, even if they got a guilty verdict, it's no guarantee they would have gotten the death penalty on this. Those same 12 jurors may have found him guilty and said, you know what, we cannot agree on whether or not to give him the highest penalty in this country of the death penalty, and he may have received a life sentence anyways at the end of that trial. But if he had been convicted after a trial, we know for a certain what would have followed would have been decades of appeals. Decades of appeals that may have had a likelihood of overturning the death penalty, may have had the likelihood of overturning the trial altogether, granting him a retrial. We've seen this happen. You ever heard of the Menendez brothers? The only reason we're talking about them today is because they didn't waive their right to appeal. Had they taken a plea and waived their right to appeal 30 years ago, we'd never be talking about the chances of them getting out today. Stranger things do happen, and I think that was taken into consideration. And there's no chance of any of that now. That's why, in my view, you can understand why the prosecution did what they did to put some finality on this thing once and for all. But what do you guys think? I know that you all have very strong feelings about this case, and I encourage you to share them with us in the comments. Another big case that found its conclusion this week was the case of Sean Diddy Combs. This is the hip-hop mogul who was charged with RICO, sex trafficking, and transportation charges. And on Wednesday, a jury that was looking like it may have been deadlocked, at least on some of the counts, came back with verdicts on all counts. This is how it broke down. He was found guilty on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Okay, one for each of his former girlfriends, Cassie Ventura, and another for the woman girlfriend who went by the name of Jane. Then he was found not guilty of racketeering, the RICO charge, the far more important charge, and both sex trafficking counts, which also carried the potential of life in prison exposure. He was not found guilty of those. What he was found guilty of was the counts that did not require the government to prove force, fear, or coercion. The transportation counts, what he was found guilty of, oftentimes referred to as the Mann Act, only asks that a person transport an individual, male or female, across state lines or international borders for the purposes of prostitution. Fairly straightforward and doesn't require that force, fear, or coercion element. He had a bail hearing later that day where Judge Arun Subramanian ruled that he should remain in custody while awaiting his sentencing because he said that Combs has demonstrated a propensity for violence as demonstrated in the video that we've all seen. Afterwards, the defense held a press conference, which looked like they were accepting an Oscar. Every single one of them got up and talked about how great this was, how great a day it was for justice and for Sean Combs. And they really enjoyed their victory lap. His sentencing is set for October 3rd. Prosecutors are going to be asking for a sentence anywhere from 51 to 63 months, or about 4 to 5 years in prison. The defense is likely going to ask for guidelines that point towards the direction of 21 to 27 months, or around 2 years in prison. Please note, he's also already served 9 months while awaiting trial, which will be credited to him. So what's happening here? There's no sugarcoating this, folks. This was an absolute defeat and failure for the prosecution. It was a defense win, but I think the better way of viewing it and analyzing it is really as a prosecution failure. You remember the military-style raids that took place of his home during the execution of warrants? We all saw that. It was a big media splash all over the news. Military-type vehicles pulled up to his homes in Los Angeles and Miami, and a search was conducted. And then for months, we wondered what's going to take place, and then these huge charges land at him. And there we are, expecting that the government is looking to put Sean Diddy Combs in prison for the rest of his life. RICO charges against one of the most wealthy and powerful names in the music industry. That is history-making type stuff. Now, why I say this is such an epic failure is because the feds usually do not overshoot themselves this badly. They usually do not overcharge things this horribly. But that's what they did here. They tried to take a crime that was designed and used primarily in cases involving the mafia and say that that should apply to this one man because he had assistance and he had power and he had money and he had influence, and he used that for the criminal enterprise of serving his own sexual and selfish desires. And the jurors just didn't see it. And you can understand why. The proof for it, though technically may have existed, it just wasn't there. And they really outdid themselves in charging this. And that's why I say this is a failure. But what do you guys think? Do you think this was more really good trial work on the part of the defense, or really poor execution on the part of the prosecution? Please let us know in the comments. Before we get into the cases also making headlines this week, I encourage you, if you think that these videos and this channel might be something that a friend of yours would enjoy, please share it with them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. It's a free and easy way to support what we're doing here. We're trying to bring you the highest quality content that we possibly can, and the best way we can do that is through your support. And please don't forget to check out Courtroom Confidential, the podcast. We can be found on all major podcast platforms, and we have a daily episode that we release there called the True Crime Minute that you might be missing out on. So please check it out. Also making headlines this week, Kouri Richins. This is the Utah mother who was charged with the murder of her husband, Eric Richins, is set to go to trial next year for his murder. She now faces 26 new charges. They include 5 counts of mortgage fraud, 7 counts of money laundering, 5 counts of forgery, 7 counts of issuing a bad check, 1 count of communications fraud, 1 count of pattern and unlawful activity. According to the charging documents, she used the power of attorney to open a $250,000 home equity line of credit on her husband Eric's premarital home without his knowledge. She then funneled that money to her own business. In the 5 months prior to Eric's death, her revenue in that business was $170,000, while the monthly debt service exceeded $250,000. She borrowed from over 25 different lenders to help support her debt, and Richins continued to use hard money loans to purchase 3 additional properties in November of 2021. By December of 2021, she had contracted to buy a $2.9 million unfinished mansion, financing it with high-interest loans that were due in 6 months. Closing was set on that mansion for the day of Eric's death. It was delayed until the day later, and according to the charging documents in this recent filing, on the day of Eric Richins' death, Kouri Richins Realty owned hard money lenders at least $1.8 million, and the day after his death, it owed them nearly $5 million. Her murder trial is scheduled to begin with jury selection on February of 2026, and Richins is accused of killing Eric with a lethal dose of fentanyl that she allegedly slipped into his drink. Her defense claims that the late timing of these financial charges suggests that the murder case is weak, and argues that the new charges are a tactic to influence jury selection. Raul Vier, this is the young man out of Connecticut. Closing arguments are set for his trial for this Thursday. Vier, who's now 20, was 16 at the time that he was charged with the stabbing death of 17-year-old James Jimmy McGrath and the assault of 3 others. In 2023, he rejected a plea deal for 40 years in prison, opting instead to go to trial, which is now currently taking place. The evidence presented so far has been that the prosecution has called 25 witnesses over 9 days. They include police, medical personnel, partygoers at these different events, and all 3 surviving victims of the stabbing. And Vier himself testified that he committed this act out of self-defense and fear. He said that he was terrified that his friend Tyler Da Silva was in danger. He claimed he didn't ask for the knife. He testified that he was confused when his schoolmate and the driver that night, Jack Snyder, handed him the knife without him asking prior to the fight. He said he waved it to scare people, but didn't realize he had stabbed anyone. During cross-examination, prosecutors highlighted inconsistencies, however, between his testimony and video footage, which appeared to show him purposefully stabbing others. During redirect, when asked if he was aware if he had stabbed the 14s, he said no, and he was just flailing his arms and waving them around wildly. With court closed for July 4th, deliberations may begin on Thursday and continue into Monday. Then there's the Brooks Houck case. This is another continuing trial in Kentucky. Thursday marks 10 years since Bardstown, Kentucky mom Crystal Rogers was last seen alive. Attorneys for Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson began presenting their case Wednesday after the Commonwealth rested on Tuesday. Houck, who is Rogers' ex-boyfriend, has been charged with murder and tampering with evidence, while Lawson was charged with conspiracy to murder and tampering with physical evidence. And his father and co-defendant Steve Lawson was convicted of similar charges back in May. Rogers was last seen at Houck's family farm on July 3rd of 2015, and her body has still never been found. Prosecutors alleged that it was a family conspiracy. They say that Houck's brother Nick, who was then a police officer for Bardstown, and his grandmother helped conceal Rogers' disappearance. And days after Rogers' father posted on social media asking for information about a white Buick seen near the Houck family farm that night, Nick and his grandmother actually sold a white Buick to a dealership. 4 days later, canines detected human remains in the rear passenger side of a vehicle, and hair similar to Rogers was found in the trunk. Defense opened their case with the testimony of Rhonda McElvoy, who is Houck's sister, who admitted to illegally recording her grand jury testimony, claiming she had paranoia due to threats and accusations, but she said she had no involvement in any kind of conspiracy to kill Rogers. The defense challenged key points of the prosecution, including presenting a canine trainer to talk about whether or not the canine evidence could be tested, and a digital forensics expert who argued about the cell phone location data. Defense witness testimony will continue Thursday, and closing arguments are expected next Monday, followed by jury deliberations on Tuesday. Then there's Stephen Stearns, charged with raping and murdering 13-year-old Madeline Soto, who was the daughter of his former girlfriend. Stearns is first facing a case on sexual assault allegations, 60 charges related to the sexual battery, molestation, and possession of child pornography, all dealing with Maddie Soto. Wednesday, there was a hearing where Judge Keith Karsten announced that he had denied the defense motion seeking to suppress the cell phone evidence, which Stearns claims police improperly seized from him. This all had to do with an argument about consent. This evidence was so important that had the defense won this motion, the case likely would have fallen apart. The defense had countered this claim, bringing the motion, supporting this motion, saying that he only gave consent to look at certain applications on the phone, but not look through the phone. That all being said, jury selection for trial is set to begin on July 22nd, and the state expects to call up to 12 witnesses and estimate that it will take 4 days. His murder trial, however, will take place on September 22nd, and prosecutors are seeking the death penalty in that case. Before we get to what's coming up on the docket next week, I just want to take a quick moment to thank you all so much for being a part of our growing Courtroom Confidential community. But I want to give a special shout out to Tracy K for their thoughtful Apple Podcast review, and to our CC crew members, Danny May Adventures and Laura Waldy 456 for their support on YouTube. Thank you guys so much. Please keep those reviews coming. We absolutely appreciate it. On the docket for next week, Gregory Moore, a former divorce attorney accused of killing his client, Eliza Sherman, in 2013, will be back in court on Wednesday, July 9th for a pretrial conference. He posted a $2 million bond on Thursday. Also, jury selection begins Thursday, July 10th for the murder trial of former Colorado dentist James Craig, accused of fatally poisoning his wife Angela in 2023. And finally, please join us on YouTube this Sunday for our special question and answer series, Sunday Funday. You're all invited to leave us a voice message at thecourtroomconfidential.com, and we will answer those live during tomorrow's live stream at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. That is it for us this week, folks. Thank you again, as always, for joining us. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find us on social media at CR Confidential on X, at The Courtroom Confidential on Instagram, or at thecourtroomconfidential.com. Have a great weekend. Have a happy 4th. Thank you for joining me, and we will see you again next week for another episode of Courtroom Confidential.